The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus Van Staden of the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, sometime in September, we don't know an exact date, but 52 heads of African states will be on their way to Beijing for the triennial Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, otherwise known as FOCAC. For those of you who don't follow these kinds of things very carefully, basically this is the China-Africa Mega Summit, and it is a huge deal that happens every 3 years. It didn't start out such a big deal, but it has become really, really important. And it's important for so many different reasons. Number one, it really charts the direction of where China-Africa relations are going, in particular from the Chinese perspective, because this, while it's called a China-Africa summit, at the end of the day, it's more of a China summit. And secondly, it really kind of gives us an indication of how much money are the Chinese going to lay out. What's been interesting is that over the past, say, 3 summits, the numbers that the Chinese are doling out in financial packages just keeps going up. Last time, it was $60 billion. And everybody wants to wonder, well, where will that end? And is it healthy? So, Cobus, FOCAC is something of a real, very, very important event. You and I are going to be helping to train journalists, and in your capacity at the South African Institute of International Affairs, you are consulting with your clients and partners about what's going on. So why don't you give us a little bit of a background on FOCAC and how we got to where we are today?
FOCAC started in 2000, and it happens every 3 years. And it tends to bounce back and forth between being hosted in Beijing and then being hosted in African countries. So it was in Johannesburg in 2015, and it will be in Beijing in September this year. And it's the preeminent forum for China to meet with African leaders and for the discussion of an announcement of new initiatives between China and Africa. So it started off very much focused on economic exchange, and since it's gone on, it kept growing and growing in terms of scope. So in 2015, you saw a lot of peacekeeping and anti-piracy and so on, other initiatives also being discussed and being announced, and including a large amount of money being given to peacekeeping under the auspices of the African Union. So what I think everyone is waiting to see, A, as you mentioned, how much money is going to be promised this time, and B, kind of how wide the scope of the relationship is going to be, and what the influence of an entrenched, empowered Xi Jinping is going to be. I think this is the first time of the first FOCAC summit after the suspension of Xi Jinping's term limits. So he is really in a very, very powerful position at the moment. And, I think it is going to be interesting to see how that reflects in FOCAC.
Okay, so what we're going to do for today's show is kind of run through a lot of the key issues that may or should be on the agenda in Beijing for the FOCAC summit. And the reason why we're doing this is because as part of our relationship, that is the China-Africa Project's relationship with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University, we have been commissioned to prepare a white paper to help train Chinese and African journalists on how to cover FOCAC. And so we thought, instead of Cobus and I just hashing out what the issues are going to be included in that white paper, we thought, hey, let's do it on the show. And basically, we're going to run through the key issues. It will eventually show up this summer in this white paper that we will, of course, share with all of you. But we have so many different topics to go through. We can't include everything in the white paper. So we're going to kind of pick what we think are the best. And for those of you who are regular listeners to the program, we do a show like this at the end of every year called the China-Africa Year in Review and Preview, where basically Cobus and I each take 3 or 4 issues and we have to defend them, present them, and disagree or agree with the other as to whether or not those are the key issues. And we're going to use that same format for the program today. So, Cobus, let's start with you. What do you think, and we're not going to do this in any particular order, so tell me an issue that you think either should be on the agenda or will be on the agenda or in some ways will influence the agenda at FOCAC coming up in September that you think we should include in our white paper.
This one I am pretty sure will not only be on the agenda, but will essentially be almost the entire agenda, or like will it will sit half of the agenda essentially. That is Belt and Road Initiative. All indications from Chinese officials that I've spoken with, and all kind of indications of where FOCAC is going, indicates that Belt and Road is going to be massive. And obviously, for those who haven't been following these issues very closely, the Belt and Road Initiative is this massive infrastructure rollout that China is doing, essentially connecting Beijing to Europe over land and over sea through two routes. The oversea route connects to Africa, so it connects to Kenya and then to Egypt. But the Belt and Road has also become this jewel in the crown of Xi Jinping's foreign policy and his international development planning. So everything is essentially running through a Belt and Road filter now. And the indications that I've seen has been that, officially the 2 points on the map of the official Belt and Road routes, the two African points on the map are Kenya and Egypt. But already we've seen that Ethiopia, essentially a lot of Ethiopian development is being seen through the filter of Belt and Road. And there's indications that the Belt and Road scheme is going to be widened in Africa. There's already discussions about ways of pulling South Africa into the Belt and Road, scheme there. There's even discussions about ways of pulling Nigeria into Belt and Road, which I have no idea how that works. But, I think it's going to be a massive theme, and it's going to be this kind of overarching theme of the summit.
I think I agree. I think this is going to be the most important filter that every decision for FOCAC will pass through. I mean, it's that important. You cannot overstate the significance of Belt and Road. And for those of you who are not up to speed on what Belt and Road is, it's called One Belt, One Road. You can look it up under Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. But if you are a student of what China is doing anywhere in the world, particularly in the developing South, then you have to understand what Belt and Road is. And it goes back to our conversation, Cobus, about how sophisticated African policymakers are towards China. We've talked for a long time how the Chinese have a policy now for each African country that's becoming increasingly refined. But do African countries have their own China policy? And bringing up Belt and Road is so important because it will help you better understand where you fit in the prioritization of Chinese foreign policy. So those countries along the Indian Ocean, on the eastern coast, leading up into the Suez Canal and the Red Sea in that area there, are going to figure and do very, very well. Those countries who are more inland, maybe not. But I think at that time, as we're trying to understand what the priorities are in Beijing, Belt and Road is definitely a very, very good indicator on how to do that. So let's talk about, we'll stay with the themes and the thematics of it all, because I think just as much as Belt and Road will guide a lot of the decisions in Chinese prioritization for FOCAC, I think Donald Trump is going to play a very important role. And I think China's emergence as a counterweight to the United States, it will not be necessarily overt in the FOCAC discussions, but it will be present there. And I think this is really how Africa in so many ways will help the Chinese, because it offers the Chinese the opportunity to do things that they can't do or won't do in other parts of the world, such as peacekeeping, a lot of their humanitarian development that they can't do in Asia because it's too contentious. But it allows them to project this sense of internationalization and openness that the United States certainly is not doing right now. And so I think Donald Trump will be present in the hall there, and how Xi Jinping will try to present himself as an alternative to the increasingly isolationist American foreign policy. What's your thought about the role that the United States may play in terms of guiding the attitude and the spirit of the discussions.
Oh, I so agree. I have many thoughts about this. I recently discussed this with a foreign policy expert at a conference, and he was saying, it's very interesting. With the Belt and Road Initiative, China is essentially moving again into using the Indian Ocean as a kind of a sphere of influence while leaving the Atlantic Ocean to the US, which I think is it's a very shorthand way of talking about it, but it provides an interesting lens to look at the role that the Indian Ocean is going to play, because of course, with the Belt and Road, that is a way for China to engage on the one side of the Indian Ocean with places like Indonesia and Australia, and on the other side of the Indian Ocean with places like Kenya. Obviously India is a world power that's extremely nervous about this. But I think the story that lies at the heart of this is exactly anxieties about U.S. influence and the way that U.S. influence is changing. The militarization of U.S. presence in Africa is one issue that I know raises concerns, and then the President Trump pulling out of the Iran deal, I think, really kind of created a moment where there is this crisis of trust about the US, so even if the US promises something now, they might well pull out of it in a few years. And so it creates this narrative of China as you said, more global, more interested in other countries, and B, in a weird way, more trustworthy, which is a weird place to find ourselves. The 21st century is very interesting.
Well, in 2018, let's consider that the United States is going to strip Rwanda of its duty-free access into the U.S. market because of a dispute over used clothing.
Second-hand clothes, like it's
second-hand
crazy.
Clothes. It is, but we're talking about the symbolism here, because obviously the value of second-hand clothes is tiny in comparison to the overall trade volume between the United States and Africa. But this is an important issue. More importantly, South African steel will now have a 25% tariff on it, and aluminum products as well, coming into the United States. And I think the symbolism of China saying our markets are more open to you than the United States, we are investing more money in Africa than the United States, and our trade volumes are 4 to 5 times that of the United States, does present a very interesting counter-narrative to the soft power message that the United States has been promoting for a very long time. I mean, it was only a couple months ago that former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was warning African countries about once again becoming too close to the Chinese. And I think that argument becomes increasingly difficult to put forward when you have the Chinese really laying out a much more expansive agenda in terms of trade and economic engagement than what the Americans are doing. So I think Donald Trump will be in the room. The Americans will be in the room, even though it will not be explicit. But it will be very, very interesting to see what the attitude of both the African participants as well as the Chinese are in relation to where they are going to invest their limited foreign policy capital. So, Cobus, let's go to point number 2 for you. What is the second point that you think should or will be on the agenda in Beijing at FOCAC?
This one I also think will be on the agenda rather than should be on the agenda, although I do think it should also be on the agenda. But it is the issue of industrialization. Obviously when the China-Africa relationship exploded originally in the 2000s, it was very resource-focused. And since then, China has, it still is very active in extractive industries, but it's also very active in construction and infrastructure provision, as we've discussed many times. I think we are now moving in the direction where Africa is lobbying very hard for China to play an active role in industrializing Africa. And China has to a certain extent responded to that. So when China was the head of the G20 in 2016, one of its flagship programs was an African industrialization plan. It was the first time that the G20 had really focused on Africa in a lot of detail. It was the first time that the G20 had been pushed, by China to really, set aside whole chunks of its thinking about to concentrate on Africa. In 2017, when Germany took over the G20, it also launched an African industrialization plan. And so it was interesting that, it seems that China in that kind of way set an agenda or made it possible for the G20 to focus on this issue. Since then, I think Chinese companies have provided a lot of actual on-the-ground industrialization. I mean, there's a lot more. I was in the South African port city of Port Elizabeth earlier this week, and we drove past massive Chinese car factories, and they are, the first automotive works, the massive, huge kind of car assembly plants, and you're seeing more assembly, and I think assembly and low-level production, and Africa is really lobbying for more of that. So I think that there's going to be, that's probably going to be quite a strong narrative at FOCAC this year.
I'm going to agree and disagree with you. I'm going to agree that there's going to be more industrialization. I don't think it will be Africa. I think it's going to be very, very country specific. Light manufacturing will go more and more to Ethiopia. Heavy industry may go to South Africa, as you talked about. First Automotive Works, BAIC, these other Chinese state-owned auto majors are really investing heavily into South Africa. There's a new auto plant that's opening up in Cameroon as well. Hybrid cars production is going to happen in Morocco from a Chinese state-owned enterprise as well. But it's going to be very, very specific. Mali, Chad, those countries, I don't think they're going to get much industrialization. The other point that I think should be made is what Irene Yuan Sun, who we had on, she wrote the book about Chinese manufacturing in Africa. It just came out earlier this year. And she talked about how it's this small to medium-sized enterprises. So we've talked only about, up until now, the massive state-owned enterprises like the auto companies, but so much of the manufacturing may happen at the flip-flop level. She talked about in Nigeria of a small factory that produces flip-flops for just pennies of margin, but yet it works, and that may actually increase as well. Only as long as there's duty-free access into the U.S. and European markets from Africa. So that may change if the politics in the U.S. and Europe change, which, as we've seen in the U.S., everything is up for grabs right now. So there are a couple variables on there, and I just wanted to refine the point, at least to how I see it, that it may not be a pan-Africa type of thing, but it may be very, very country-specific.
Yes, and I think it depends a lot on the specific kind of regulatory situation in your specific African country. Speaking with Chinese officials, I have heard a lot of complaints about a place like South Africa, for example, which has very quite complicated local labor law and very specific and pointed kind of rules about how many local and particularly local black people need to be employed at which levels. It's a whole story. So Chinese, that kind of quite kind of assertive regulatory envibrement tends to cause some unhappiness with Chinese investors, and they tend to to contrast that with what they call the business friendly attitudes in East Africa, particularly in Kenya and Ethiopia. So it'll be very interesting to see which specific African countries get what.
But let's remember that African countries are not competing just with other African countries for these investment deals. They're competing with Vietnam, Cambodia, South America. I mean, everybody's vying for this manufacturing that the Chinese are now starting to offshore more and more. The other thing that's challenging manufacturing, which may accelerate in the next 3 years between this FOCAC and the next FOCAC, is the rise of automation here in China. More and more factories are being computerized. Artificial intelligence, machine learning is getting into the production system much more. So it may not actually even be necessary to offshore the production to places like Africa or Vietnam if it can be done here without humans or a lot fewer humans along the way. So it's really a race against time. And I'm not sure, based on what you've said, Cobus, that a lot of African economic policymakers understand that they have to make the most investment-friendly environments in order to attract the Chinese, or else those Chinese investors will turn to Mexico, Vietnam, Cambodia, all those different countries that are also vying for it. Do you get the sense that they understand that this is a competition?
I think they do understand that, but I think they frequently have limited maneuverability because those kind of kind of trade-offs, the classic Asian development trade-off, which is like, okay, you're going to be making super crap wages, you're going to be essentially almost be slave labor, but hang on, if you do this for a few decades, then we'll all be rich and then it will be a developed country. That kind of Asian development calculus is hard to sell politically in Africa because people come from such a history of exploitation. So wages low wages are not new in Africa, and so they're very difficult to sell. And I think that is actually a big problem.
Okay. Let's continue on with our agenda. Point number 4 for me, and this really in some ways should be point number 1 in the priorities. I doubt it's actually going to be referenced explicitly, but it should be. And boy, that is the issue of debt. I would say the past 12 to 18 months, we've seen an increase in awareness of the issues of the surging levels of debt in Africa, particularly in places like Ethiopia and Kenya, which have taken on enormous amounts of Chinese loans. There was a great graphic that I posted on my LinkedIn page earlier this week about the amount of debt that the Kenyans have taken on from the Chinese, 5 to 6 times that of anywhere else. Now, there's 2 ways to look at the amount of debt. You can look at it one way, which is positive, that people are borrowing from the Chinese because it's really the opportunity of a lifetime to get this kind of money at these kind of rates, even though in many instances, the Chinese rates are not that competitive. But the Chinese offer a package of services that nobody else can provide. So you get the financing, you get the construction companies. In some cases, you get the labor, and you get this kind of turnkey operation that will then, presto magic, you get a bridge, you get a highway, you get a railway, you get a port. No one else really offers that kind of comprehensive package. But at the same time, the worrying levels of debt are bringing back flashbacks to the 90s and the 80s when African debt was crushing the economies, making it impossible to do anything other than repay them. And eventually it had to be eliminated in terms of people wrote off billions of dollars in debt. Now, we got an indication just recently about how China may behave if, in fact, these African countries who have taken on a lot of debt can't repay them. One of the highlights of President Mnangagwa, sorry, that one I never have gotten well, but one of the highlights of the president's trip was that he had a lot of debt, written off by the Chinese. The Zimbabwe debt was taken away, and that was, I think, a very, very good indication of how the Chinese may, in fact, deal with some of the debt levels, because really at the end of the day, while the debt levels are high for African countries, they're not significant for the Chinese. This is the second largest economy in the world. So really, the numbers are in the billions, but they're the low billions. This isn't going to bankrupt the Chinese if Kenya goes, falters on its debt. But it is very, very, very important for the Kenyans. So this question of debt, Cobus, what's your take on it in terms of, the financial package that will eventually come out? That's going to be the headline of FOCAC. How much did the Chinese give? More than 60 billion, less than 60 billion? But that 60 billion is not a grant. It's not them giving money. It's them, in many ways, loaning it through concessional loans, low-interest loans, all various forms of loans. And we should be concerned, I think. But at the end of the day, what's your thought on this?
Yes, at least 35, if I remember correctly, I think roughly about 35 billion of that 60 billion was in the form of concessional loans. And very little of it was in the form of grants. The rest was mostly in different kinds of institutional support. So, yeah, I mean, that is such a big issue. I also had it on my list. The case study that is really sent kind of reverberations right through Africa was the situation in Sri Lanka, where Sri Lanka couldn't repay a loan on a big port, and then essentially they lost control of their port. Like the Chinese company. The Chinese company came in and essentially took over the workings of the port, and what was a Sri Lankan kind of national asset turned into essentially a Chinese privatized, kind of asset, on Sri Lankan soil. And so that, I mean, you mentioned the writing off of loans. I think there's a bunch of African loans will probably be written off. But, I don't think China is really in the market of positioning itself as someone who lends and then just writes off loans.
No.
And so I think it's gonna be very interesting the first time there's a real default coming up, and then to see whether there is any kind of sovereignty loss happening in the same time. Because if there is, then that changes the China-Africa politics significantly, and it's gonna lead to some kind of nationalist kind of backlash, panic, in Africa, which is going to be very interesting.
So a couple countries or a few countries to watch in this space. Angola has taken on somewhere, I think, north of $25 billion of Chinese loans. Certainly Kenya is in that space as well. Ghana is also very, very heavily in debt to the Chinese, and Uganda as well. So those four countries, and Zambia as well, that's correct. And a lot of that is against natural resources. So in the future and the fate of these economies is tied to the commodity price and the commodity markets. So it's very, very risky. I do agree with you that the Chinese are not going to write off a lot of this debt. There's a possibility that they might. But the Sri Lanka case, it kind of bugs me a little bit because people often bring that one out as an example. And the argument that I have with people about this is that nobody forced the Sri Lankans to get into this deal. And this is talking about national agency, and we talk about agency a lot on this program. The fact is that they went into this deal and they had to put some collateral up, just like anybody does. I have a mortgage on my house. If I don't pay that mortgage, well, guess what? The bank comes and takes my house. I don't necessarily think that what the Chinese did in Sri Lanka is morally wrong. No one forced them to. This was not a gunpoint colonial type of deal. The Sri Lankans didn't have to take this type of loan, and they didn't have to put the port up as collateral. But since they couldn't pay back the debt, it only seems reasonable that the Chinese get something for it. I mean, doesn't that make just sense? I'm confused why people are so outraged over this when, in fact, a lot of us have mortgages, and that's the way that capital markets work.
Yes, definitely. No, I 100% agree with you. I wonder even if it is really. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are outraged by it. But
a lot of people are. Yeah.
But I think also in Africa it is also just concern. About kind of concern about what that will mean. Actually, in real life, if that situation were to occur, and then also how it would play out politically, domestically, which I think, I can imagine it would play out badly.
Okay. Well, we're running out of time, so why don't you just quickly do a lightning round of 2 or 3 other points that you think should or will be included on the agenda before we go?
There's actually only one big one, and that is going to be the role of the AU, the African Union. The African Union has been pushing to take on a different role than it has. Paul Kagame, who's the president of Rwanda, is also this year the head of the AU, and he has been pushing a set of reforms which would essentially kill FOCAC as we know it. Like, he suggested that instead of having all these many ministers going to meet China, there should be a smaller delegation, a selected delegation empowered to speak for the whole continent. That is one of the reforms that he's suggesting. The AU was pushing for a kind of an overseeing role, where they could have a voice in all the different particular kind of deals being negotiated between China and individual African countries, to have a say in whether this will help Africa, to integrate continentally, which is of course one of their big goals. And so they are coming from this comes in the background of the recent signing of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which has turned Africa into one of the world's largest free trade zones. So all of this, Africa is moving towards greater integration, and they have to, because at the moment intra-Africa trade is very, very low. So it's about 15% of all African trade is within Africa, and they're trying to move it up because that is the one really proven way of developing the continent's entire economy. So the African Union is pushing to get more control and more of a say, and China has so far not been amenable to this at all. They're not particularly interested in having the AU take that role. And I can well imagine that big, powerful African economies like Egypt, like Nigeria, like South Africa, probably won't be particularly interested in that either. I think they would very well like the AU to stay in its corner and for them to make bilateral deals the way they'd like to. So, so that's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't have that one on my list. That's very interesting. I'll definitely keep that in mind. Let me run through a couple issues and I'll get your take on it. I think we're going to see a greater emphasis on the internationalization of the yuan, that more and more of the Chinese financing packages into Africa will be done in yuan so as to avoid the currency conversions into the dollar, particularly in moving away from buying oil in places like Angola in yuan. This is something very interesting to watch with respect to the Iranian sanctions, that the Iranians will continue to sell a lot of their oil to the Chinese, thereby circumscribing or getting away from the U.S. sanctions, but they're going to be selling it in yuan. And that trend will, I think, continue into Africa a lot more. And so let's keep an eye out on the FOCAC package, the financial package, and see how much of it is done in yuan as opposed to dollars. I also think we're going to see a greater emphasis on humanitarian objectives in FOCAC. Remember that just this year, the Chinese announced a new foreign aid agency. Up until now, foreign aid had been dispersed through the Commerce Ministry, but now it's being done through a dedicated foreign aid agency like DFID in the UK or USAID in the United States. So we may actually see this as the coming out party for this new Chinese foreign aid. I think we're going to see a lot more emphasis on students as well. China now accepts more African students than any other country in the world. It's a foreign policy that's working. It's a soft power initiative, a public diplomacy initiative. You see here in the streets of Shanghai and in Beijing lots of young African students, and it's very, very exciting. So maybe part of the FOCAC package might be an academic exchange, kind of stepping that up more. Maybe an expansion of the Confucius Institutes in Africa might also be on order as well. And then very quickly, I think we're going to see a much more focused financial aid package rather than spreading the money out across the continent. I think we're going to see it concentrated on Belt and Road countries, maybe on some of the industrialized countries in Africa, and on strategically important countries. So this means that landlocked countries that don't have a lot of resources and are not as geopolitically and geostrategically important may in fact suffer, and that too may be one of the filters. Okay, final words from you on either my comments or what you think is going to be coming ahead in FOCAC, and just what we should be thinking about between now and September.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think definitely for me the biggest one, the one that I definitely think will be on the agenda, the one that of the ones that you mentioned is UN internationalization. I think that's definitely going to be a big issue, and of course it figures into the wide logic of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a different form of globalization, that is not dominated by traditional 20th century Western institutions. So I think increasingly the Global South is asking this question of so why are all oil transactions taking place in dollar? Why is that the global rule? So I think increasingly China is providing a kind of a space where those kind of conversations can happen. I think in relation to the humanitarian issues, I agree with you, and it's going to be very interesting to see how exactly that's going to play out. Because so far, China has been playing an interesting kind of game in this issue, around this issue in China, in Africa, in the sense that they tended to respond to crises, like the war in South Sudan, and occasionally getting involved in trying to mediate there, like in South Sudan. But generally, they have not been. They've not been assigning blame to anyone. They try to deal with crises as they come up, but they haven't been trying to say, okay, this government needs to change or this government needs to be, these.
Oh, you're never going to see that, though. Oh, no.
I also don't think you're going to see it, but
too confrontational.
No, yeah, I agree with you, but
that violates the non-interference kind of thing.
But at the same time, China now has a base on the continent. It is generally interested in doing more humanitarian issues. So there's a limited scope there where you can be involved in that space in Africa and at some stage not become politically involved. Even if you are resisting it with all your might, frequently great powers that are involved in African conflicts end up being pulled into a side anyway. It's very, very difficult to maintain this kind of lofty angel kind of medical teams, a role that China's been trying to play so far. So if you look at at a very complicated situation like in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where Joseph Kabila is trying to push for additional presidential terms and so on and so on, it becomes a very, very difficult line to walk. It'll be interesting to see whether they can.
You know what's funny? You and I, we didn't talk about, for over the past half hour, not once did wildlife come up. And in our last FOCAC show, wildlife was quite important. I mean, obviously the ivory issue was big. And that's both, I think, worrisome in one sense, because I think there is this sense that, China outlawed the ivory sale domestically here in the PRC. So I get the sense that a lot of people think, well, you know what, take that one off the agenda. Everything's good. We're done. The elephants are safe. Let's move on to the next thing. And the fact is, though, that a lot of the elephant ivory trafficking and pangolin trafficking is happening through Vietnam and through the southern borders. And, China's borders are very, very porous when there's money involved. And so wildlife may be on there. So I'll put that down as an honorable mention, but I just thought it was interesting that it didn't come up on yours or mine, our top 4 or 5 list.
Yes. Another related one that didn't come up, which I think might well come up on the actual agenda, is fishing. Because China has been so overzealous in fishing around African waters.
The distant fleet. Yeah, the distant fleet. So as you can see, the list of issues is very, very long. This is potentially going to be the most interesting FOCAC that we have seen in, the past, say, nine years. But now we're getting to some very, very interesting topics. I think it's going to be fascinating to see what's in and what's out and what is just hanging in the hall. Donald Trump will be looming there. Xi Jinping will be looming there and guiding the discussions in so many ways. So I think that'll be very interesting. As I mentioned at the top of the show, Cobus and I are going to be writing a white paper that will kind of take some of these issues, consolidate them, make it easy to read in about 4 or 5 pages as a helpful guide for journalists, but we're going to distribute it to everybody. That will come out in the late summer, probably sometime around August, just before the September summit. So we'll bring that. And then we always get an email saying, why did we say that only 52 countries are joining? And people say, don't you know there are 54 countries in Africa? Well, the only 2 countries that will not be joining are those 2 that still recognize Taiwan. They are not invited to FOCAC. That is Lesotho and Swaziland, correct?
No, Swaziland and Burkina Faso.
Cobus and I will be working on the white paper for the next few weeks and months, and then it'll be out, and we can't wait to discuss this. And of course, we want to hear from you. What do you think should be on the FOCAC agenda? We have so many different ways for you to kind of share with us. LinkedIn is a great way. Cobus is ramping up his LinkedIn page. Mine is up and running. You can find both of us there. Facebook, Twitter, all of the different dots and W's. We'll have the addresses at the end of the show. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, email as well. Email addresses are all over our website and in the show notes of this podcast. So reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. So for this edition of the China and Africa podcast, I'm Eric Olander for Cobus Van Staden. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.